Inheriting her great-uncle's crumbling estate seemed like nothing more than a massive tax burden to Beatrice Caldwell. She never expected to discover a hidden iron door buried behind the wine cellar, or that the shocking multi-million-dollar secret locked inside would threaten to tear her entire family apart. The mahogany-paneled office of attorney Charles Whitmore smelled of lemon polish and impending disappointment. Beatrice Caldwell sat stiffly in a leather wingback chair, her hands folded over a worn handbag. Across from her sat her cousin, Simon Gallagher, a man whose expensive tailored suit could barely contain his restless, arrogant energy. They were there for the reading of the will of Theodore Montgomery, their eccentric great-uncle. Theodore had been a ghost to Beatrice, a reclusive figure who had estranged himself from her side of the family decades ago. To Simon, however, Theodore was the golden goose. Rumors had always circulated that Theodore was sitting on a massive shipping fortune, and Simon had spent the last 10 years playing the role of the devoted, sycophantic nephew waiting for his payday. Attorney Whitmore cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he broke the seal on the thick manila envelope. I, Theodore Harrison Montgomery, being of sound mind, do hereby divide my earthly possessions as follows. To my nephew, Simon Gallagher, I leave the entirety of my liquid assets, bank accounts, and stock portfolios. Simon leaned back, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He shot Beatrice a look of pure pity. The total value of these liquid assets, Whitmore continued, his voice devoid of emotion, amounts to $42,310. The silence in the room was absolute. Simon's smile vanished, replaced by a deep, flushed red that crept up his neck. "Excuse me?" he snapped, leaning forward so abruptly his chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. 42,000? That's impossible. The man owned Montgomery Freight. He was worth tens of millions. Mr. Montgomery liquidated his holdings in the late 1990s. Simon, Whitmore explained calmly. Where those funds went? I cannot say. My firm only managed the accounts, listed here. Simon was furious, muttering curses under his breath, convinced he had been cheated. To my great niece, Beatrice Caldwell, Whitmore read on, ignoring the outburst. I leave the property known as the Hawthorne Estate in Portland, Maine, including all of its physical contents, on one strict condition. She must reside in the house alone for no less than 14 consecutive days before any sale or transfer of the deed can be authorized. Beatrice blinked in shock. The Hawthorne Estate was a sprawling, notoriously dilapidated Victorian mansion perched on a jagged cliff overlooking the Atlantic. She didn't want a decaying mansion. She lived in a small apartment in Chicago and was drowning in medical bills for her mother's assisted living care. But a house, even a ruin, was real estate. If she could just endure 2 weeks in the drafty old place, she could sell the land and finally pay off her mother's debts. 3 days later, Beatrice pulled her rented sedan up the overgrown gravel driveway of the Hawthorne Estate. The house loomed against the gray Maine sky like a rotting Gothic monument. The paint was peeling in great strips, the wraparound porch sagged dangerously in the middle, and the windows were caked in decades of salt and grime. Unlocking the heavy oak front door, Beatrice was hit by a wall of stagnant air, smelling of damp wood, mothballs, and old paper. The interior was a labyrinth of hoarded antiques, stacks of yellowing newspapers, threadbare Persian rugs, and dust-sheet-covered furniture choked the grand hallways. It was unsettlingly quiet. Determined to make the house presentable for a real estate appraiser, Beatrice immediately set to work. For the first 3 days, she scrubbed, swept, and cleared debris, exhausting herself to keep her mind off the sheer isolation of the property. On the 4th evening, a violent coastal storm rolled in. Thunder rattled the antique window panes, and the flickering incandescent lights in the parlor finally gave out, plunging the house into darkness. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight, Beatrice navigated the creaking floorboards to find the basement door. She needed to check the breaker box. The wooden stairs groaned under her weight as she descended into the cavernous cellar. The air down here was significantly colder, smelling sharply of wet earth and rust. She found the breaker box and flipped the main switch, but the power remained dead. It was a blown fuse on the city's end. Sighing, she swept her flashlight across the basement. It was partitioned into several rooms, including a massive, dusty wine cellar built into the foundation. As the beam of light tracked across the empty wooden wine racks, something caught her eye. The back wall of the wine cellar was made of red brick, but there was a deep, jagged crack running down the center. What struck Beatrice as odd wasn't the crack itself, but the draft. In the damp stillness of the basement, a distinct, cold breeze was whistling through the fissure, rustling a stray piece of cobweb. Curiosity overriding her unease, Beatrice stepped closer. She placed her bare hand against the brick. The masonry was loose. The mortar here was a different, lighter color than the rest of the foundation, almost as if it had been added decades after the original construction. She walked over to a rusted workbench in the corner of the cellar, grabbing a heavy steel crowbar and a masonry hammer. Returning to the wall, she wedged the flat edge of the crowbar into the crack and struck it hard with the hammer. Crack. A chunk of brittle mortar fell to the floor. She struck it again, putting her back into it. The brick shifted. With a grunt of effort, she pried the brick loose and pulled it out. Beatrice shined her flashlight into the dark hole. She didn't see earth or foundation behind the brick. She saw solid, reinforced steel. Heart pounding in her chest, Beatrice spent the next 4 hours tearing down the false wall by the beam of her flashlight. By midnight, her hands were blistered and her clothes were caked in red dust, but the wall was gone. Revealed in the gloom was a massive, industrial-grade iron door, the kind you would expect to see on a bank vault in the 1930s. It was seamlessly built into a reinforced concrete frame. In the center of the door was a tarnished brass combination dial, and securely looping through a thick latch was a heavy, rusted padlock. Theodore Montgomery hadn't just hidden something. He had entombed it. Beatrice stood before the iron door, her breathing shallow in the cold basement air. The metal was freezing to the touch. She tugged at the heavy brass padlock, but it didn't budge a millimeter. The combination dial was completely seized with age and rust. She needed a key, and she needed a set of numbers. For the next 2 days, the cleaning of the house was entirely forgotten. Beatrice turned the Hawthorne estate upside down. She tore through Theodore's chaotic study on the second floor, emptying out filing cabinets, shaking out the pages of thousands of dusty hardcover books, and prying up loose floorboards. She found nothing but old tax returns, uncashed dividend checks for pennies, and bizarre, paranoid journal entries about the weather. It wasn't until she began packing up Theodore's master bedroom that she found her first clue. Beneath the heavy 4-poster bed was an old brass-bound cedar chest. Inside, beneath layers of moth-eaten wool blankets, was a pristine velvet-lined box containing a heavy family Bible. The leather cover was stamped with the year 1892. When Beatrice opened the book, the pages didn't flutter. They were glued together. It was a hollowed-out dummy. Nestled inside the cutout square was a heavy, ornate iron key and a faded, sepia-toned photograph. Beatrice carefully lifted the photo to the light. It showed a young Theodore Montgomery standing shoulder to shoulder with her own grandmother, Catherine. They were smiling, looking relaxed and wealthy, standing in front of a shiny vintage automobile. Beatrice flipped the photograph over. Scrawled in fading fountain pen ink was a single line. "The debt is settled, Catherine. They will never know. The 24th of August, 2038. The 24th of August, 1938. Beatrice gripped the iron key so tightly it dug into her palm. She sprinted down the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing through the empty house, and threw open the basement door. She didn't even bother turning on the main lights, relying solely on the bright beam of her flashlight as she ran to the wine cellar. Her hands trembled as she inserted the iron key into the rusted padlock. It resisted at first. She jiggled it, applying pressure until a loud, metallic clack echoed off the stone walls. The padlock sprang open. She pulled it free and tossed it to the dirt floor. Next came the combination dial. She wiped the dust from the brass face with her sleeve. 08. She spun the dial right, feeling the heavy internal tumblers grinding against decades of disuse. 24. She spun it left, past 0, landing perfectly on the 24. 38. Right again. She grasped the heavy iron handle and pulled downward. The mechanism resisted, screaming with the friction of metal on metal, but finally, it gave way with a heavy, resonant thunk. Beatrice braced her boots against the stone frame and pulled the vault door open. A rush of dry, incredibly stale air pushed out of the dark space. It smelled faintly of cedar and oiled canvas. Beatrice raised her flashlight and stepped over the threshold into a room that had not seen the light of day in over 80 years. It was a climate-controlled bunker, the walls lined with lead and thick oak paneling. The beam of her flashlight swept across the room, illuminating a fortune so vast it stole the breath from her lungs. Stacked against the left wall were dozens of wooden crates, stamped with the insignias of Swiss banks that had closed nearly a century ago. On a long mahogany table in the center of the room sat rows of velvet-lined jewelry display cases. Beatrice walked to the table in a daze. She opened the first velvet case. Inside, gleaming under the harsh LED light of her flashlight, was a breathtaking diamond and sapphire necklace, undeniably Victorian, featuring stones the size of robin's eggs. She opened another box to find a collection of flawless emerald rings and heavy gold pocket watches engraved with the names of European aristocrats. But it wasn't just jewelry. Moving to the wooden crates, she found one with a loosened lid. Prying it off, she discovered neat, shrink-wrapped stacks of paper. They were pre-World War II bearer bonds for major industrial railroads and early oil conglomerates. Unlike modern stocks, bearer bonds belong entirely to whoever physically holds the paper. The face values were staggering. 50,000, 100,000. There were hundreds of them. Theodore Montgomery hadn't lost his shipping fortune. He had converted it into untraceable physical wealth and buried it in the dark. As Beatrice circled the center table, she noticed a single item sitting alone on a brass pedestal. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger. She opened it, expecting an inventory of the vault's contents. It was an inventory, but the margins were filled with Theodore's cramped, frantic handwriting. Beatrice began to read, her eyes widening in horror as the true history of her family unspooled across the yellowed pages. The wealth in this room didn't belong to Theodore. The ledger detailed a systematic, decade-long embezzlement scheme. During the Great Depression, Theodore had been the junior partner in a massive shipping conglomerate. The senior partner, the man who actually built the wealth, was Frederick Gallagher, Simon's grandfather. Theodore had secretly siphoned millions from the company's offshore accounts, using the chaos of the 1929 stock market crash to cover his tracks. He had purchased the jewels, the bonds, and the gold, hiding them away while Frederick Gallagher's company collapsed into bankruptcy. The ruin had sent Frederick to an early grave from a stress-induced heart attack, destroying the Gallagher family's standing and leaving them scrambling for scraps for 3 generations. Theodore hadn't hidden the money out of greed. He had done it out of pure, spiteful vengeance over a perceived slight, ensuring the Gallaghers would suffer while he lived a quiet, reclusive life, guarding a dragon's hoard he never intended to spend. And he had confided this secret to Beatrice's grandmother, Catherine, binding their side of the family to the sin. "Oh my God," Beatrice whispered to the empty room. "Simon is the rightful heir to all of this." The inheritance was a poisoned chalice. Theodore had left Beatrice the house specifically because he knew the vault was here. He was passing the burden of his crime onto her, forcing her to either keep the stolen fortune and betray her cousin or hand it over to a man who despised her. Before Beatrice could process the moral weight crashing down upon her, a sharp, terrifying sound shattered the silence of the estate. Crunch, crunch. Heavy tires were tearing up the gravel driveway directly above her head. Headlights swept across the basement's tiny ground-level ventilation windows. Beatrice froze, killing her flashlight instantly. Car doors slammed. Multiple heavy footsteps thudded aggressively onto the sagging wooden floorboards of the front porch. Then came the violent, sustained pounding of a heavy fist against the solid oak front door. "Beatrice!" a voice roared from outside, muffled but unmistakably furious. It was Simon. "Open the damn door, Beatrice! I know you're in there!" Beatrice stood in pitch darkness, surrounded by tens of millions of dollars in stolen wealth, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "Attorney Whitmore told me about the property stipulations," Simon yelled, rattling the heavy brass doorknob with enough force to shake the frame. "I know Theodore was hiding something here. You are not stealing what belongs to me." Then came a sound that made Beatrice's blood run completely cold. Smash. The sound of shattering glass from the kitchen window at the back of the house. Simon hadn't come for a polite conversation, and he hadn't come alone. They were breaking in. The sound of shattering glass from the kitchen window echoed through the floorboards like a gunshot. Beatrice stood paralyzed in the center of the subterranean vault, the cold, heavy air pressing against her skin. Above her, heavy work boots thudded against the hardwood. Simon hadn't just come to argue. He had brought muscle. "Check the study! Check the master bedroom!" Simon's voice barked, distorted by the layers of wood and stone separating them. "She found something! I know she did! Find the basement stairs!" Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in Beatrice's mouth. She swept her flashlight across the interior of the vault. The massive iron door she had just pried open was still ajar. On the inside of the door was a heavy steel wheel, similar to a submarine hatch, designed to lock the vault from within. She lunged for the door. The rusted hinges screamed in protest as she threw her entire body weight against the thick iron. "Did you hear that?" A deep, unfamiliar voice echoed from the hallway above. Came from down there. They were coming. Beatrice dug her boots into the dirt floor and heaved. The heavy vault door swung shut with a terrifying, final boom that shook dust from the concrete ceiling. Frantic, she grabbed the internal locking wheel and spun it clockwise. The massive internal steel bolts groaned, sliding into the reinforced concrete frame with heavy echoing thuds. She was locked in. Less than 30 seconds later, the beam of a high-powered flashlight pierced the darkness of the wine cellar outside. "Over here!" a man yelled. "Boss, look at this! Someone smashed a hole right through the brick foundation." Footsteps hurried across the basement floor. Beatrice backed away from the iron door, killing her flashlight. She stood in pitch darkness, surrounded by millions in stolen wealth, holding her breath. "Beatrice!" Simon's voice was right outside the metal door now, vibrating with a manic, unhinged energy. "I see the padlock! I know you're in there! Open this door right now!" Beatrice remained silent, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Listen to me, you little thief," Simon snarled, striking the iron door with something heavy, likely the masonry hammer Beatrice had left on the floor. The sharp clang made her flinch. "That old man stole my life. He stole my grandfather's company. Whatever is in that vault belongs to the Gallagher family, not some estranged niece from Chicago." Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. Simon didn't know the truth. He thought Theodore had just hidden his own legal fortune out of spite. He had no idea the wealth inside was literally stolen from Frederick Gallagher during the Great Depression. "Simon, you need to leave!" Beatrice finally shouted back, her voice muffled but authoritative through the thick steel. "You are trespassing! I have my phone, and I am calling the sheriff." It was a bluff. The lead-lined walls of the 1930s bunker killed any cellular signal instantly. Her phone displayed a stark "no service." Simon laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Go ahead! Call them! What are you going to tell them? That you're hoarding my inheritance in a secret bunker?" "Mitchell, get the sledgehammer from the truck. We're breaking the hinges off this thing." For the next hour, the basement turned into a war zone. The deafening, rhythmic bang of a 10-pound sledgehammer striking the iron door reverberated through the tiny bunker. Every strike sent a terrifying vibration through the floor, shaking dust onto the velvet jewelry cases. But the 1930s vault had been built to withstand natural disasters. A sledgehammer was practically useless against the reinforced steel frame. Realizing brute force was failing, the heavy strikes stopped. Beatrice heard muffled arguing outside. "It's not budging, Mr. Gallagher," the man named Mitchell grunted. "We need an acetylene torch or C4 to get through this. I didn't sign up for a bank heist." "Don't you walk away from me," Simon snapped. Inside the vault, Beatrice knew she couldn't stay locked in forever. The air in the unventilated room was already growing stale and warm. She needed leverage. She walked over to the mahogany table and picked up Theodore's leather-bound ledger, then moved to the open crate of bearer bonds. "Simon!" Beatrice yelled, stepping close to the door. "Stop hitting the door and listen to me! I know what's in here!" The basement went quiet. "Then you know it's mine," Simon panted. "It's not a bank account, Simon," she yelled back. "It's physical. It's jewelry, gold, and paper bonds. If you manage to spark a fire trying to cut through this door, you will burn tens of millions of dollars to ash. Do you understand me?" Silence. The threat of destroying the wealth was the only thing that could pierce Simon's greed. "I have the ledger, Simon," Beatrice continued, her voice steadying. Theodore wrote everything down. He didn't just hide his money. He embezzled it from your grandfather in 1932. This is stolen property. If the police come, or if the federal government finds out about this vault, they will seize every single penny of it as evidence of a historic financial crime. Neither of us will get a dime. A heavy silence fell over the cellar. The reality of the situation was finally dawning on him. "What do you want, Beatrice?" Simon asked, his voice losing its violent edge, replaced by a cold, calculating tone. "I want you to send your men away," Beatrice demanded, "and I want you to call attorney Charles Whitmore. Bring him here. We are going to sign a legally binding contract before I open this door." It took 4 agonizing hours for attorney Whitmore to arrive at the Hawthorne estate. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long, gray shadows across the shattered glass on the kitchen floor. Down in the basement, Beatrice stood shivering in the dark vault. She had spent the last few hours methodically sorting the fortune. The bearer bonds, stacks of untraceable corporate paper worth millions, stayed in their wooden crates. The Victorian jewelry, the loose diamonds, and the heavy gold pocket watches she carefully packed into a thick canvas duffel bag she found in the corner of the room. When Whitmore finally arrived, his voice carried through the iron door, trembling with shock at the sight of the smashed wall and the hidden bunker. "Beatrice, my dear, it's Charles Whitmore," the lawyer called out nervously. "Simon has sent his men away. We are the only ones here. Please, open the door." "Slide the contract under the door gap first, Charles," Beatrice commanded. A few moments later, a manila folder was pushed through the dusty half-inch gap beneath the iron door. Beatrice grabbed her flashlight and read the terms they had hastily drafted upstairs. The agreement was simple. Beatrice would voluntarily forfeit all claims to the physical paper assets, the bearer bonds contained within the vault, signing them over to Simon Gallagher as restitution for Theodore's crimes against Frederick Gallagher. In exchange, Simon agreed to legally purchase the Hawthorne estate from Beatrice for $3 million in cash, enough to pay off her mother's medical debts and secure her future, and Beatrice would keep the contents of the canvas duffel bag as an undisclosed family inheritance. Crucially, the contract stipulated a strict non-disclosure agreement. Neither party would ever speak of the vault's existence to the authorities. It was extortion wrapped in legalese, but it was exactly what Beatrice needed. She clicked a pen and signed her name on the bottom line, sliding the folder back under the door. "It's signed," she announced. Beatrice gripped the heavy steel wheel and spun it counterclockwise. The bolts retracted with a heavy clank. She pulled the door open, stepping out into the dim light of the wine cellar. She looked exhausted, covered in red brick dust, but her eyes were hardened. She was clutching the canvas duffel bag tightly against her chest. Simon practically shoved past her, his eyes wide with a terrifying, obsessive hunger as he rushed into the vault. Charles Whitmore stood frozen, staring at the crates of bonds and the sheer scale of the hidden room, his jaw slack. "It's real," Simon whispered, running his hands over the stacks of pre-war railroad and oil bonds. "It's all real. He ruined us, but it's finally mine." Beatrice didn't look back. She walked up the basement stairs, out the front door of the crumbling mansion, and into the crisp morning air of the Maine coast. She threw the heavy duffel bag into the trunk of her rented sedan and drove away without saying a word. The aftermath of the Hawthorne estate discovery remains one of the most fascinating, quietest transfers of wealth in modern history, but it did not end the way Simon Gallagher envisioned. 3 weeks later, Simon attempted to quietly cash the first batch of the 1930s bearer bonds at a major financial institution in New York. He believed he was invincible. He was wrong. Bearer bonds, while once a staple of anonymous wealth, were heavily restricted by the federal government in the 1980s to prevent money laundering and tax evasion. Attempting to redeem tens of millions of dollars in 80-year-old unregistered corporate paper immediately triggered an automated red flag within the Securities and Exchange Commission and the IRS. Within 48 hours, federal agents raided Simon's penthouse. Because the bonds were tied to a historic embezzlement case involving the defunct Montgomery Freight Company, the government declared the assets as the proceeds of an unsolved federal crime. The entire fortune, every single paper bond Simon had fought so viciously for, was seized under civil asset forfeiture laws. Simon spent the next 5 years drowning in legal fees, fighting the federal government in a futile attempt to prove the money was rightfully his. He lost everything. Beatrice Caldwell, however, never faced a single question from the authorities. The $3 million from the sale of the Hawthorne estate legally hit her bank account before the federal investigation into Simon even began. As for the canvas duffel bag, antique jewelry and unmarked gold coins do not have serial numbers. They are not tracked by the SEC. Over the next 2 years, Beatrice quietly attended high-end private auctions in Geneva and London. She sold the Victorian diamonds and the sapphire necklaces piece by piece to anonymous collectors. The true value of the duffel bag was never made public, but financial experts who later analyzed the rumors estimated the jewelry alone was worth upwards of $12 million. Beatrice paid off her mother's medical debts in full. She bought a beautiful, heavily secured home in a quiet suburb of Chicago, ensuring her Mildoltha had round-the-clock care. The ghost of Theodore Montgomery and the toxic legacy of his revenge was finally put to rest. Beatrice had walked into a decaying mansion burdened by a cursed inheritance, and through sheer grit and quick thinking, she walked out with the only thing that truly mattered, her family's freedom. If you were captivated by this real-life tale of family betrayal, hidden fortunes, and the ultimate twist of fate, don't keep this story a secret. Hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with a friend who loves a thrilling mystery, and make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next incredible true story.